Good morning and welcome to our very first future session of the day, Resilient Energy Infrastructure Transition with a focus on hydrogen. Hydrogen is likely to form a critical pillar of clean energy transition for countries across the world. It offers a green, carbon-neutral alternative to generate electricity as well as to support transport and industry. It's estimated that nearly 6% of cumulative global emission reductions can be achieved by switching to hydrogen as a fuel. This has led to what we're seeing as the emergence of a hydrogen economy. This session on hydrogen will deep dive into the risks and potential solutions to building disaster resilience of new hydrogen infrastructure and resilience measures for investments in this infrastructure for clean energy. Our moderator for this session is Dr. Mona Anand. She is Director, Research and Knowledge Management at CDRI. She's trained as an architect and development planner, and she's been involved in policy development and practice of safe and sustainable habitat development in South Asia. Through this process, Mona has leveraged research and knowledge-based initiatives to inform policy decisions, mainly within South Asia. Over to you, Mona.
Thank you, Aishwarya. Greetings to everyone. It's my honor to welcome you all to this very first session of Day 3, which is the last day of the ICDRI 2022. And it is such a pleasure to see professional friends and colleagues join us in the audience in the studio today. Warm welcome you all. We have a packed agenda for the next hour. We had a bit of a delay also, so we'll see how we can make up for the lost time. And we have panelists joining us from across the globe who will together reflect on the imminent transition of energy infrastructure. And as Aishwarya has highlighted, the focus is indeed on hydrogen here. I do want to highlight for all of you that this session builds upon an earlier DRI dialogue, Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Dialogue series that CDRI conducts. And this particular one was conducted in November 2021. And some of our partners from that conversation have stayed engaged with us on this issue, and they are here today as a part of this panel, and I will be introducing them to you as we move forward. Just a quick takeaway from the dialogue, I want to bring that to you here. We observe that globally, as countries move to a net zero future, the emergence of the hydrogen economy is more than evident. Still in a nascent stage, but it is indeed evident. And this will require massive investments for repurposing existing or creating new energy infrastructure, including generation, transportation and storage facilities. And by the way, all of this is happening in the backdrop of an increasing frequency and severity of disasters and the climate variability that we're already experiencing globally. Rising temperatures, varying precipitation trends, frequent extreme weather events are posing huge risks to all infrastructure assets, components and systems, and hydrogen is going to be no exception there. So moving on, let me just brief you about the session. The session is graced by our panelists, and I'll introduce them to you. If you could just get them on screen, please. We have Dr. Bertrand Manet from the International Atomic Energy Agency joining us today, Dr. Uwe Rehme from the International Energy Agency. We have Dr. Ruud Kempener from the European Commission. We have Dr. Jay Furman from the Pacific Northwestern National Laboratory, and Dr. Deepesh Perwani from the MNRE, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, will be joining us also in the panel. Dr. Rangan Banerjee, I don't know, there was a technical glitch at his end, so I don't know whether he managed to finally come into the panel or not, but he was also expected to join us. So the session is structured in two segments. In the first one, we will have a panel discussion and we'll interact with our panelists and hear from them what their perspectives and insights are on this subject. And the second, which is a shorter segment, will give you a glimpse of the initial work that we have undertaken in this space at the CDRI. Professor Rangan Banerjee also made it despite the technical glitch. Thank you. I'm so pleased to see all of you on the screen here. So to delve deeper into the potential of hydrogen as a solution for the future, may I call upon Dr. Bertrand Manet. He is a senior economist, International Atomic Energy Agency, and a very, very trusted friend of the CDRI. We have walked the initial steps of the hydrogen journey with him. Dr. Bertrand, we indeed appreciate your encouragement to the CDRI to take this subject forward along with your colleagues. So coming to your question, in your experience, how large is the hydrogen opportunity that lies in front of us, especially with regard to decarbonization of hard-to-abate sectors? Over to you, Dr. Manet.
Thanks very much, Mona, and good day all. Very happy to be with you. Thank you for the invitation and for organizing such an important conversation. So to your question now, I guess you mentioned a couple of important points in your own introduction. We know hydrogen is critical to fully decarbonize or to achieve the decarbonization of the entire economy, because there are some of those industrial segments in particular that cannot rely on anything else but hydrogen to really remove fossil fuel usage, because electrification falls short of providing options there. And that's the case for cement, for steel, for shipping through ammonia, for instance. So it's most important to create some infrastructure that indeed, like you mentioned yourself, will be able to operate and function properly, reliably, under a changing environment. And we know that we will be facing a different climate, irrespective of the future state of the climate, by the way. If it's 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees or more, we know that we'll be facing more damaging extreme weather manifestations. So it's important to understand and design upfront a system that will respond not only to the low carbon obligation, but also to provide a source of energy that will be again prepared to withstand those events. Now, you know how big the market is going to grow. So some people say it's going to be 5 times bigger. Uwe may confirm from the IEA, five times bigger than what it is now, roughly speaking. Some others, if you ask the private sector, they may see a bigger opportunity. They will say 10 times. The Hydrogen Council, for instance. But all of that suggests that it's most important first, and it's going to grow incrementally, but fast. So how can we organize that? When it comes to resilience, I think the important aspect here is location. It's like the real estate market, if I may compare that. Location is most important, because this is the only way to understand how I'm going to be affected at the local level, and what is going to be my degree of exposure to those future climate and weather and water risks. So in the short term, we know that hydrogen is going to be mainly produced as it is now by refineries, some chemical centers, and there's not much you can do about it. So you just need to basically cope with those events. We know there are fragile infrastructures. If you look at the Hurricane Ida in the US last year, that came and actually brought down a lot of those refineries in Louisiana. Almost 20% of the refinery capacity was brought down just by one hurricane. So those existing infrastructures, they need to be adapted, but they will still remain fragile. And in the midterm, of course, one has to build those infrastructures around the demand centers, the hydrogen valleys for some of them, that will be located in the US, in Europe, in China. But again, we need to understand how to locate and to position those big industrial clusters that will respond to the local needs, factoring the future risks as we know them, at least for now. And then in the longer term, as the market organizes globally, there's going to be a big global trade, global circulation of hydrogen throughout the world, as shipping costs in particular come down. Then we'll be able not only to target those locations that will not only provide abundant low carbon energy, renewable energy, for instance, and others, but those locations in the world that will basically be less exposed to future climate risks. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertrand. And you're right, you know, what you mentioned has just stuck in my brain. It will grow. The market is expected to grow incrementally, but really fast, and we need to be ready to sort of, keep pace with that trend as the market sorts itself out. Next, let me invite Dr. Rangan Banerjee, who's a very well-known name in the energy sector in India. Dr. Banerjee serves as the director of IIT Delhi, the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi in India, and he has also been with us since we first engaged in the DRI dialogue. Dr. Banerjee, in your opinion, what role can research play in promoting the resilience of hydrogen infrastructure? I think Burton made some solid points about the need to really focus energies on the resilience aspects. What role do you see research playing in this space? Over to you, Dr. Banerjee.
Thank you, Dr. Mona. And we need to understand when we are designing, so when we're talking of hydrogen infrastructure, if you look at, I'll just preface my comments by looking at India. In India, we have relatively very little hydrogen infrastructure today, but we have an aspiration and we have an expectation that we would be having a significant amount of hydrogen infrastructure. So a lot of this is going to be built. We are, of course, going to interface in the initial phase. We will be actually blending hydrogen with our natural gas pipelines. And the issue here is when we think in terms of retrofitting existing infrastructure, we have a large centralized energy infrastructure in most countries. And when we think in terms of the impacts of climate, when we are talking of higher temperatures, we are talking of extreme events on the existing infrastructure, understanding what can be done, what kind of impacts, what kind of factors that can be put so that we have a resilient system, and whether or not it's going to be a combination of centralized and decentralized, to see when we think in terms of the future, we are looking at green hydrogen. And when we talk of green hydrogen, we are looking at it's going to be PV or wind or biomass as the source, and then we have the electrolyzer, then you have the pipeline. There are issues related to safety. So when we designed energy infrastructure in the past, we would design it for some typical kinds of wind speeds and temperatures, but often the design was not meant for extreme events. And with climate, the frequency and the possibility of these extreme events has gone up. And so I think we need research to understand how do we redesign new things, how do we retrofit, what kind of impacts will be there, and build it into our planning. And this may involve initially some additional amounts of costs, but basically it is it's a technology, it's a system. We can simulate what would happen if we had an infrastructure. So there is a possibility for simulation and modeling. Then there is because the point is, whether we like it or not, we are trying to do a lot of mitigation, but there is also some amount of climate change which is real and actually happening. And it's going to, over the next few decades, we are going to see more of these. So we need to build in resilience so that our vulnerable populations do not get affected. We also need to build in the possibility, we need to build in energy security. That means in case there is a storm, we have another alternative way to do this. And since most of the hydrogen infrastructure is going to be now built in, it's going to be, it's a new infrastructure. We can do this at the design stage itself. And so that means that we need to have an agenda for research in terms of what does resilience to climate mean? What kind of disaster preparedness do we have? And what would that mean in terms of modifications into our design process? Since in many cases what happens in this is that we are always first cost sensitive, and the We are trying to see how we can meet this where we reduce the initial cost. This would need some careful thinking. It would also need some pilots and some assessments. And I think this is where CDRI and countries across the world need to start in thinking in terms of how do we, should it be through mandate, should it be through incentives, should it be through pilots? What kind of studies will show how things can be modified so that we have both safety, resilience and security, energy security. And I think this opens up a whole world of both research and implementation, and unfortunately we do not have the time to do these in wait for the research before we implement. It's got to be done as we go. So that's all that I have to say in my opening remarks. Thank you, Dr. Banerjee.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banerjee. That was very succinctly spelled out, the research agenda that you were just talking about. And what I'm also taking away is this whole fact that you mentioned about the situation being dynamic and evolving so rapidly, just as Bertrand was also talking about. And also this whole aspect of systemic resilience, regardless of the scale and scope of the system itself. So, and the idea is to ensure energy security. So thank you so much for those inputs. I now turn to Dr. Ruud Kempener. I'm trying to sort of zoom in into specific regions. Dr. Ruud Kempener currently serves as the Deputy Head, Renewables and Energy System Integration Unit at the European Commission. Dr. Kempener, from your vantage point, how significant is the role of hydrogen in the EU's energy system integration strategy, specifically in terms of the Union's commitment to reach carbon neutrality by 2050? Over to you, Dr. Kempener. I'm just told there was a glitch with him also. He joined and then he seemed to have dropped off. Let's continue zooming in. I'll move to our colleagues from the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, Government of India. Dr. Dipesh had joined in. Dr. Dipesh? Dr. Vandana managed. Oh, very nice. Thank you. Dr. Vandana, she is the Joint Secretary in the Ministry, and we are very proud to have her as part of our panel today. And she is a very senior bureaucrat of the Indian Administrative Service, and she has served in several key ministries of the government, including the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, as well as the Defense Research and Development Organization. May I hand over the floor to you, Dr. Vandana Kumar, please.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. It's lovely to be in your midst this morning. Good morning, very warm good morning from Delhi to everyone on the panel. Absolute joy to join you all. We are in the midst of promulgating, formulating a national green hydrogen mission. We are all in this conversation. I think we all understand and acknowledge how important hydrogen could be to our energy security, energy transition goals. Europe is particularly sanguine about it. Over 17 countries around the world have announced their hydrogen strategies, stroke action plans, stroke policies around the subject. We have also initiated several preparatory steps around, but it's the mission which will really give impetus to the entire initiative. What we are trying to do through the National Green Hydrogen Mission is bring about efforts, very synergistic efforts towards bringing about a comprehensive ecosystem for green hydrogen. So we try and address the issues of demand creation, strengthen the supply side, particularly emphasize the efforts for indigenous manufacturing of vital equipment and other critical technologies. The other key enablers remain R&D and innovation to bring down continuously the costs of green hydrogen. We do know that at this point of time, the cost of green hydrogen would be higher than gray hydrogen. And initially, perhaps we need to bring some amount of parity, but in the long term, we do need to make green hydrogen affordable to ensure that we have sustainable bulk demand for green hydrogen. So that's going to be a very vital piece of the entire mission. Infrastructure is, of course, very important, and we are so delighted that CDRI is working on this piece. Resilient infrastructure is going to be extremely important to hydrogen. To that extent, we also look forward to the engagement of CDRI and all the experts from different parts of the world to collaborate in this effort. To my mind, collaboration is going to be key if green hydrogen or hydrogen were to become a reality. If we do talk about green hydrogen, India is blessed with plenty of sunshine, a strong renewable energy sector which is growing at an accelerated pace. It has become viable, it's an attractive proposition, so we do hope that India will be able to produce green hydrogen on a large scale, not just for its own economic sectors, the hard-to-abate sectors, but also meet the global demand. So we do see that the global south may be producing bulk of green hydrogen, and countries in the northern hemisphere may be large consumers. Of course, a lot of technology will also come from the northern hemisphere, and there is bound to be a lot of collaboration for this entire mission to succeed around the globe. In that context, again, infrastructure gains a lot of relevance, and not just infrastructure which is resilient, but what we mean by green hydrogen, how far back do we go in the value chain, the standards, the certification. The regulatory framework is another very vital piece in green hydrogen. We look forward to collaborating in all of these areas with the stakeholders around the world. Risk mitigation would be a key pillar again, and I see risk not just from the hazard perspective, but also from the other risk quadrants, be it operational risks, strategic, financial risks. How do we set up an ecosystem which is resilient, has resilient supply chains? We can also address the risks of supply chain and demand as well, the demand supply variations that might occur. And given the current geopolitical situation, it becomes all the more important to address all of these issues. So I do look forward to collaborating with the experts on this panel in various of our efforts, but also going forward in the conversations around green hydrogen. It's a very nascent field, but together we can make sure that we can scale up this new initiative, this new perhaps a movement towards green hydrogen, greening our economies in hard-to-abate sectors. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar. That was very interesting. I do want to point out, I think you were being very modest when you said that you're taking initial baby steps. You know, I have personally been a witness, a ringside view of the energy that you and your team have been investing in this entire piece of work. So, we're really looking forward to working forward with you as we move forward. You did mention about the need to collaborate, and that I think is, is a cross-cutting theme in everything that we do at CDRI, and of course the panelists here, they're all for it. With that, I think we should move to a slightly more technical orientation in the conversation. I would like to now hear from the civil engineer on our panel, Dr. Jay Furman. He's a researcher working on the issues of life cycle of energy infrastructure, and he works at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And we invite his reflections on the integration and interoperability of hydrogen infrastructure with the existing energy infrastructure systems for safe and sustainable transition. Dr. Jay, over to you, please.
Hi, thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's truly an honor. I would say I think the biggest thing that we're thinking about is that not all hydrogen molecules are the same. So different end uses of hydrogen require very specific pressures and temperatures, and the energy and costs of achieving those is pretty heterogeneous. And so for something like an industrial use that, can use a pipeline, the cost, relatively low pressure, the cost of that is fairly low. But for something like fuel cell electric vehicles that use compressed gas, you end up with, about a sixth of the per unit of energy you need in the form of electricity to compress and transport that hydrogen. And then for something like airplanes and ships that use cryogenic liquids, the refrigeration and compression energy ends up adding about a 30% energy penalty. And so hydrogen isn't going to replace electrification necessarily. Electricity is going to come for the ride. And so in order to have a sustainable and resilient hydrogen sector, we're going to also need to be really thinking about the electricity sectors as well. And then just to echo some of the points that were made about the, just the distribution and pipeline infrastructure, the vulnerabilities of those are going to be similar, just to echo, to that of natural gas. But in terms of the risks, I think there's also, a lot of opportunities. And so hydrogen could end up playing a role as part of a resilient electric grid. And so we're finding that it might not make sense in terms of like short term for like the sub-hourly demand fluctuations that you would see in the grid. And this is due to kind of the low round trip efficiency of the maybe gas turbines that might be similar to natural gas peaker plants or electrolyzers and fuel cells that are much higher cost. However, for seasonal scale storage under a deep deployment of renewables, intermittent renewables, hydrogen could end up playing a pretty large role, we think, in balancing that generation, in a way that you might need that exceeds the capacity of grid-scale batteries. So basically that would involve producing clean hydrogen, storing it in underground salt caverns, for example, and then you would have it available to, for example, during a huge heat wave when you have a huge spike in air conditioning demands, you can help keep up with that. Another thing that we're seeing in our modeling is that about 15 to 20% of the hydrogen that's produced ends up being, coming from biomass, and so if there's then that brings in all of the vulnerabilities of agriculture to climate change, and sort of that nexus. And so if there's a heat wave or a flood that stresses your crops, including biomass, that could end up disrupting your hydrogen supply. And so that's something that, we need to be thinking about as well. And so I guess what I'm trying to go with all of this is that, we really need everything to be sustainable and resilient to have a sustainable and resilient role for hydrogen.
Thank you, Dr. Jay. You also highlighted the interdependencies, with regard to production and how it is closely connected with what happens outside with regard to, heat waves and dry spells. And I would extend it to the other extreme, which is flooding and cyclones. How does the production system get impacted by those kinds of events? Thank you very much for that intervention, Dr. Jay. I now want to move on to Dr. Uwe Reme. He's the head of the Hydrogen and Alternative Fuels at the International Energy Agency. Dr. Uwe and his colleagues have also been our co-travelers in this journey, exploring the resilience of hydrogen infrastructure last couple of months. Dr. Uwe, we'd like to understand from you your perspective on how do we ensure that the transition to clean energy is both inclusive and resilient. We want to hear from you, how do we get to focus on people and communities and make sure this is inclusive? Dr. Vandana also talked about energy security. We want to make sure it's available to people who need it most. Over to you, Dr. Uwe.
Thank you very much, Mona. I mean, in the context of this question of an inclusive and resilient energy transition, I would like to focus on one objective, which is actually Sustainable Development Goal 7 of providing universal access to clean and affordable and resilient energy. And the projected increase in climate hazards is really posing a threat to reaching this goal. Today, still about 770 million people lack access to clean energy or to electricity. These people are mainly located in Africa, but also developing countries in Asia. And the poorest part of the population is actually often hit hardest by natural disasters. So addressing these challenges by providing access to clean energy often enhances also resilience of the overall energy system. For example, Morocco achieved universal electrification through a successful rural electrification program based on solar home systems. And these centralized solutions lead to a more diversified energy system, which often tends also to be more resilient against climate impacts and natural disasters, while also reducing local air pollution by replacing otherwise used diesel generators if we think of off-grid electricity systems in small communities or rural villages. And hydrogen actually can also be part of the solution to provide access to electricity. For example, fuel cells can provide backup power to hospitals, to schools, and also provide off-grid electricity supply to rural villages. For example, South Africa has been using methanol fuel cells to provide off-grid electricity supply to a small village. And so overall, I think that the measures taken for reaching a resilient energy system, and the measures taken for inclusive energy transition are closely interlinked and actually can reinforce each other. So I guess there's really synergies between these two goals of reaching resilient and inclusive energy transition. I guess I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Uwe. Just building on this, what kind of policies do you think we need to support this intention? Dr. Uwe?
I think it's really important that we understand what are the, of course, one really has to look at the local, if you talk about increasing access to electricity. Of course, there are many solutions already available today. If you think about solar PV, if you think about batteries. So these could be the first steps in providing, for example, access or off-grid electricity supply. And hydrogen is maybe not really the first solution to consider the planning process, but it can be, in some cases, be an interesting opportunity to complement these other technologies and measures. And I guess there is a really important the planning process to where governments and can really help to define strategies and making complete assessments of what could be good strategies in reaching access to clean electricity.
Sure, thank you. So it's evident, the potential is huge, it's evident, but we are still trying to scratch the surface of the whole problematic and see how we move forward with that. I want to turn to now Dr. Banerjee to understand from him what kind of capacities do you see will be needed to take this whole agenda forward, sir?
I think in terms of capacity, we need to have capacity for the design and implementation. We need to have capacities in terms of research. And we also need to retrain the existing people in the energy sector and the infrastructure sector. So we need to think out what all is needed in terms of interventions, and then what kind of manpower and retraining. So a roadmap towards creating this resilience is essential before we can identify the types of capacity required. And I think existing engineers, designers who are designing the different systems, people who look at the entire life cycle, as well as what are the ways in which we can simulate and see the impact of different types of disasters. So I think one needs to have case studies of different types of existing structures and new structures, and the interventions needed. So one needs to think out the whole picture, and this is visualizing future infrastructure as well as existing infrastructure and the impacts. So it has to be both in terms of training as well as research projects and pilots. And I think roadmaps on this, which could be coordinated by different governments or intergovernmental agencies or CDRI, would be the first step before we look at projecting the requirement for people and additional capacity.
Thank you very much. Absolutely, that's a very strong point there, that we do need basic research to be in place. We need to look at case studies of solutions that can be adapted to this new requirement that is in front of us, along with the potential that it promises there. I will take my last question, and I will request this response from Dr. Bertrand Manet. Bertrand, at some point you had mentioned about climate science accompanying policy making as far as hydrogen infrastructure is concerned. Do you want to shed some light on that comment that you had made earlier?
Sure, thank you, Mona. So if I restrict myself to those physical risks, those physical impacts, and Dr. Kumar was fully right, of course, reminding us that there are other risks with respect to demand and the overall interconnections between people and systems and communities. But if I stick to the physical risks for now, of course, there's a lot that can be that should be learned from climate science directly. And in recent years, climate science, weather sciences have had a great deal actually defining models at very fine grid resolutions that can help assessing impacts at a very local level. And that's what you need when you want to understand your actual exposure, the chemical plant that might produce the hydrogen, the electrolyzer itself. You really want to understand at the local level which are going to be the weather conditions in the future. And now the weather science allows for this. So that's very important. The IPCC has made great efforts, I must say, to compile this information, to make it accessible, and to characterize those risks at the local level. So beyond those reference regions that the IPCC has defined, one can now download the future impacts based on different storylines and narratives at the local scale. That's what you need really to understand your own exposure. And what the IPCC highlights, amongst others, is this new notion, it's a growing strand of literature, of those compound events. So it's not only your exposure to a given event, be it a drought, a coastal flooding, some hurricane, some aridity episodes, for instance, but it's the concurrent events that may occur in the future. And the science is clear, pointing us to those more and more frequent compound events which are going to be the most damaging. And here this is very much a multidisciplinary approach that is needed to factor the climate science into the design of new adapted climate resilient infrastructures. And there I think the policymakers have a great role to play, of course, to allow for this dialogue between climate scientists, energy experts, and industrial players to put it all together and form a system which is going to work in coordination. And the other point I want to mention here is the importance of emergency preparedness plans. So there are risks that we will not be able to anticipate and that we have to face anyway. And there, it's most important to understand collectively how we can reduce our exposure to risk by increasing redundancies, by putting in place some early warning systems that will allow for the best possible coordination when the event actually occurs. And we do need to reallocate resources and to allow for the system to keep on running and to keep, in the case of hydrogen, to keep on supplying hydrogen to whoever community or industry may need it. Okay, so I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burton. This actually made my task much easier. You've summed it up so beautifully. You picked some key points from other speakers also. Thank you very much. We will close this segment here, but before we disperse, may I invite on stage Mr. Kamal Kishore. He is the co-chair of the CDRI Executive Committee, and he was the inspiration for our perspective paper on hydrogen. As soon as he returned from the COP, may I invite you, Kamalji, on stage, please. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd request you to just, release this perspective paper for us, and also perhaps, share your excitement and your interest in this subject.
The paper is hereby released. So, I mean, I don't know anything about hydrogen, but everybody is talking about hydrogen as, the new economy will be hydrogen economy. That's going to be an essential element of what the energy future would look like. And given that there are a huge number of challenges, some of these are outlined in this paper here, the kind of governance it would take to manage that energy economy, we are not familiar with that. The kinds of exposure it will have to physical disaster and climate risk, we are not fully prepared for that. And if you see, there's a table in the perspective paper, how rapidly the transition is happening, how more and more countries are coming on board, coming up with their own strategies, putting out in the public domain. So I think this is the time to actually proactively engage with that process and put in place measures for managing physical disaster and climate risk. And that primarily has three dimensions. One dimension is what the last speaker was saying, as to how do we make the most of finer resolution, downscale climate information that is becoming increasingly available to us. So how do we integrate that in planning our hydrogen infrastructure, in terms of its production, its transportation, its utilization. And the second element of that is how do we get the governance, risk governance for that right. It's not just about technical aspects, it's also about managing, governing, having the right kind of accountability frameworks. So I think that is the second element of what perhaps needs to happen. And the final is that capability. How do we quickly build capabilities for doing what we are talking about in this perspective paper? The traditional systems of power generation, transmission, and distribution have 100 years of history, and hence very well developed capabilities, institutions that contribute to the development of that capability. This is new. How are we going to be future ready to have the kind of capability it would take to do it in a manner that fosters resilience rather than locks us into risks? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was beautifully summed up. With that, I would express our deep appreciation for all our panelists. Madam Vandana Kumar managed to join. She seems to have dropped off the call. So thank you very much to all our panelists. Thank you, Kamalji, for joining us. And these are initial conversations. There's a long road ahead, but as it was earlier pointed out, we need to move very fast on this road because the journey is long and the landscape is evolving very, very rapidly. With that, thank you very much. And also, we would like to acknowledge our colleagues here in the audience. Thank you for joining us. Those who've joined us virtually, see you very soon in the next session. Thank you. Bye-bye.